Hello, everyone. This is Craig with NGP Van. I am joined by our friends Stephen and Molly from Change Research. It is just 12 o'clock noon right now, so we will wait just a moment or two for participants to join, and then we'll do some introductions, cover a quick agenda and things like that. So I don't think anyone, I know I usually mention this kind of as a joke, but it is true. I can't sing. I don't know about you, Stephen or Molly, so maybe we'll just, put this on hold for just a minute while people come in. We don't want to hurt anyone with my voice or my singing voice. So there will be no hold music. It'll just be us sitting here for a moment while people join us. Oh, and while you're joining us, if you can, we'll go through some housekeeping in a minute. But while we're getting started and people are joining, just drop in the chat who you are, who you're with, where you're from. Like if you're, here on behalf of a campaign or a PAC or a union, some other org, just let us know where you are, what part of the country you're in. Just drop it in the chat and we'll try to make this as engaging as possible of a webinar. Great, keep them coming. A couple state parties. Hey, Fayette Township, nice, not too far. Cool. We still have a few people joining us, so but we can probably get started. Stephen and Molly, do some quick intros. Say hello to the crowd.
Yeah, Stephen, you go first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Claremont. I've been doing polling, public opinion research. I always hate to say this, since I graduated from college in 1993. So this is, I guess, 30 years. Started doing phone polling for a what was prominent Democratic firm at the time, Hickman Brown Research. Did the presidential race for Bob Kerrey and Al Gore. And worked on my own for several years at Third Eye Strategies, as well as doing some public policy research for an organization called Every Child Matters. And then in 2018, I went to Change Research, saw the different way they do polling online, which we'll get into, and saw that this was the future to be able to continue helping campaigns all up and down the ballot win elections. Thank you, Craig. It's great to present this, talk about polling, and also introduce my colleague, Molly.
Thanks, Stephen. My name is Molly McInerney, like two guys, Mac and Ernie, and I'm a marketing manager with Change Research. I've been with Change a little over 4 years now. And as part of my role at Change, I work with our clients and prospective clients to help them understand how research and public opinion polling and qualitative research can fit into their campaign, and what combinations of approaches is going to help them accomplish their goals, win their campaigns, and move progressive causes forward around the country. So I'm very excited to be chatting today with everyone, and really grateful to Craig and the rest of the NGP Van team for bringing us together today, and very excited to dive in.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you. Just personally here, even before I worked at NGP for the last couple of years as a campaign manager, I had worked with Change Research on several campaigns, some of which maybe we'll talk about later. And then even before that, just with polling to inform strategy, which I think is super important. And it's interesting that a lot of campaigns don't stop and think about it, or organizations in general, on how some of that polling can work its way into different parts of our strategy. So kind of excited to talk about that here. And, how we can use the different ways we can use polling to inform our campaigns. And I say campaign, not just an electoral campaign, meaning that like any kind of, messaging that we want to do or any kind of marketing that we want to do, whether it's our organizations, our PACs, unions, things like that, using polling to inform our public opinion, certainly. Cool. All right. Well, maybe we'll jump into some of the housekeeping. We get these questions often, are we recording this? And as people continue to come on, just know, and I'll pop this in the chat too, we will be recording this, or we are recording this, I guess is the best way to put it. So as soon as this is done, when we're done with this webinar, today, our team usually puts together closed captioning to make it more accessible for everyone. So we will do that with the video, and then we'll add the closed captioning to the video, and then we'll put it online. I can't remember if we do YouTube or Vimeo, one of those places, but the team will put it online, and then we will create an email that will go out to everyone who attended, or actually everyone who registered. We'll get an email with a copy of the recording. I believe we have a copy of the deck as well, so we will provide a copy of the deck, and then contact information for Change Research. If anyone wants to get in touch with them, we can talk more about that later too. If there are any questions that get asked on this call that we can't answer during the call, Stephen, Molly, and I will work to make sure that we put together answers, and then we'll include those in the follow-up email that has the link to the video and things like that. That way we have a copy of everything for everybody, and we make sure that we cover any questions. If there are so many questions, it might even warrant a follow-up webinar. So, we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. On this graphic here, you'll see that we have a Q&A and a chat. Chat is great for keeping a really engaged webinar. So if you want to just, kind of talk and chat in the chat area, that's great. If you have a very specific question about something that's being covered in one of the slides, if you could drop that in the Q&A section, that helps to separate the questions kind of from the chatter, just to make sure that we don't miss any questions as we move along. Most of the work here is going to be done by Stephen and Molly, thankfully. So I'll be ducking into the chat and the questions to see if I can answer anything, and then bring to the front any questions that are really relevant or topical based on what they're saying. So we'll cover that as we move along. Don't feel like you need to hold questions till the end. Drop them in the Q&A, and we'll pause as we move along. And then we have a few slides, but we'll definitely have time at the end too to cover additional questions if the material that we're presenting sparks anything. So with that said, I think that's the last of my my slides here. I'll let you take over, Stephen and Molly.
Thank you. Well, again, I'll just reiterate, thank you, Craig, for having us on. We're very excited to chat about our favorite subject, polling. Before I jump right into it, I do want to give a little bit of background information on Change Research. As we said, Change Research is a public opinion research firm, and we were founded after the 2016 election with a specific purpose to democratize access to public opinion research. So our goal is to really make polling more accessible, more affordable, and higher quality for campaigns and organizations of all sizes. And we work with, Democratic and progressive campaigns and organizations around the country, and have used that experience to really build off of our capabilities, and to have a lot of examples to speak to about the wonderful ways that polling can help your campaign win and drive progressive change. So to start at the beginning, why conduct a poll? I often describe it as most places you wouldn't drive without GPS these days. Polling gives you a GPS roadmap for your campaign or for your issue advocacy efforts. It allows you to get a sense of things like the lay of the land, the issues voters care about, the general anxieties people are feeling, whether they feel like their community is going in the right direction or the wrong track, whether there's an awareness of an election, whether they're aware of a campaign that's happening, or people are a little bit less clued in to what's happening in the electoral environment. It also allows you to do, sort of zoom out from your day-to-day and get a sense of the big picture perspective in your specific, county or city or district. So oftentimes, if you're running a campaign or working on a campaign, you are in the middle of it. You're talking to people every day. You're hearing a bunch of people's opinions and thoughts and feelings, and it can be hard to discern, what is the opinion across the whole district. What is the most important thing I need to be focusing on? And that focus is what a poll can help give you. It can help you understand opinions across a representative mix of voters. And within that, it also allows you to dig into subsets of voters. So that helps you identify patterns, figure out where and with whom you want to prioritize talking about different things in your campaign. You might find that, on one side of town, there's really shared opinions or issues that are coming up that is not true in another part of your district. So things like that is a really helpful information you can learn from a poll. Also, just where your race stands in the moment. So where are you vis-a-vis your opponent, vis-a-vis other national or state leaders who are running in a given election? And then this is a really big one that I think is a really important part and an important thing that you can learn from a poll is how are people talking about an issue, or how are they understanding and communicating about certain events or issues or your campaign? It's so important to speak to voters in language that they understand. And oftentimes, if you are really knees deep into a specific policy priority, or you've made your life's work focusing on a few things, so much information about it, and you can forget, or just be communicating in a way that has all that information that you come from that regular voters don't always have. So it helps you just understand, what are the words people are using? How do they understand what I'm talking about? Is there ways that I can communicate this message or this point or this argument in a way that is more clearly understood from general voters? All right, and then of course, the most important thing here is, how do polls help you win or help candidates win? We all know that a campaign, you're often working with limited resources, and it's so important that you're using those resources effectively. And I often have conversations with candidates or campaigns who are really weighing the pros and cons of whether to spend some of their hard-earned dollars on a poll. I often really encourage folks to do a poll for a couple of different reasons if they can't afford to. One, I often think of it like if you're starting a business, you write a business plan. If you're running a campaign, you have a campaign plan. And if your campaign plan is informed by polling and informed by research around what voters care about and believe and think and the words they're using, it makes for a really, really strong and effective plan that you can then also share with all of the other individuals you're working on your campaign with. It can be something that is really informative for your consultants, for your other vendors who are putting together communications or digital or other things that are communicating your message for you. Again, I sort of touched on this in the last slide, but this part about focus, I think that polling can really help you focus effectively. And even thinking about when you're using Van, for example, a poll can help you inform and decide, okay, who are the individuals that I want to include in my audience? Who are the people I'm planning to prioritize? Say I get some more resources later in the campaign. Who are the folks who are maybe not included in that first audience, but if I have more resources, the second group of people I want to communicate with. That focus and prioritization is information you can get through a poll. And again, it also just helps ensure you're making the strongest arguments possible for your campaign. So often in a poll, we're testing some of your messages, your positive messages, and we might also test negative messages. Where are the biggest weak points? Where is your opponent have the strongest argument against you? How can you get ahead of that? How can you make sure you're being responsive and counteracting those potential weak points? ahead of time and that you have a plan for that. And then finally, it's very helpful sometimes when you have a poll that can validate the viability of your campaign. So if you are going to different potential donors or different folks in the party or things where you need to show, I know that I have a chance to win here. I'm talking to people on the ground. It really feels like there's an opportunity here. If you have a poll that can also show, and I fielded this poll, it shows that I have a viable race if I have equal resources. That can be really, really helpful in raising those resources and helping you build a public narrative that this is a winnable race.
Thank you, Molly. A big part of campaigns, like in the way that like us as political professionals and candidates in the media talk about elections and campaigning and politics, is designed to make it sound very complicated, and that races are determined by lots of different factors and there's lots of different considerations, all of which are true. But in many ways, what I love about politics and particularly polling is a lot of what we do is really simple. And when you're thinking about a campaign, particularly if you're working for an incumbent or you're working against an incumbent, you need to find answers to two fundamental questions in order to win. Are there reasons for voters to want a change? And is the challenger a credible option? And part of what makes this so interesting is that voters answer that first question very early. They could answer it a year, 2 years, 6 months early. And that's what early polling will show you. Is when you're testing the environment, right direction, using questions like right direction, wrong track, job approval of the incumbent, favorability of the incumbent, where that person stands, how likely someone will be to reelect them or vote for someone else, where they stand against various potential challengers, you'll know whether that person is viable or not. If their disapproval matches their approval or is higher, people believe things are going on the wrong track, the incumbent is not reaching 50% of the vote, they have low reelects, that shows that there is opportunity to win. I think just for an example, looking at a poll that we just recently put out with Rick Scott in Florida. And there's lots of reasons that Democrats don't feel like they can compete in Florida. But you look at that poll, Rick Scott is unpopular. He has a terrible job approval rating. There's lots of reasons for people to not vote for him. So the first question is essentially answered. The second question, is the challenger a credible option? And that's what polling and the whole campaign is all about. If voters can answer that early, or they can answer that up to election day, they can change their mind throughout the campaign. It's a big reason why an incumbent goes negative very early on, particularly an endangered incumbent. They want to make the challenger not a credible option. We worked in Iowa last year for Admiral Mike Franken against Charles Grassley. And we could see throughout, and this was confirmed in the Des Moines Register's polling as well, that Grassley was viewed as too old. Job approval rating wasn't great. Favorable rating was the lowest he had in recorded Des Moines Register polling. He was below 50%. And even though the assumption was that he'd win because he's won every election going back to the 1950s, is that he told us the answer to question number 2 is what matters, because his first ad was a negative attack on Mike Franken. And so polling really, you want to do a poll to answer these two questions. One, whether the candidate should even bother running, and 2, how do we sell this candidate as the option to replace the incumbent?
Even quick question on your number 2 there.
Yes.
So in asking, is the challenger a credible option, for those of us who are incumbents wondering that, a lot of times we get, or we hear from the electorate, maybe through volunteers, maybe through activity in the district, whatever, that a certain issue is starting to track or trend, even before you pull that issue. Would the strength of maybe just that one issue make a challenger a credible option? Or is that something that you would maybe discover through polling on issues?
That's absolutely what you would want to do. I'll give you sort of an example, a very current example. In the Nashville mayor's election, we worked for the first place finisher last Thursday, Freddie O'Connell. And we found out very early on in polling that the new Titans Stadium, the Titans built a stadium or Tennessee built a stadium for the Titans in the late 90s. And they had just approved a new big one. And that was very unpopular with voters in the city. They did not want that money spent on that. And a lot of the candidates running were pro stadium. And Freddie found out very early on through listening of where the public was, that there was lots of negative sentiment, and it matched up with how he viewed the stadium deal. And when we did polling, we confirmed that and showed that this was one of the key differentiators. This was for an open seat. Key differentiators between him and everyone else, and knew that that's not only was just like vote for Freddie because he was opposed to the stadium deal, but used that opposition to build the larger case of this is how he's going to fight for you. This is how he's going to fight for Nashville. This is why he's the best candidate for the city in the future. So yes, very much so, Craig. And part of that is, how do you build that issue and that opposition and what you're hearing to where it's consistent with the candidate's values and narratives we want to shape? Because the public doesn't go through an issues checklist. Well, this person is with me on 5 issues and this other one's with me on 3, so I'll go with the one who's 5. It's what does that candidate stands on the issues tell you in terms of what that person is going to do for you, what they care about, and how they're going to govern going forward.
Thank you.
So the basics of a well-conducted poll. This is sort of the challenging, both the arts and science of polling. There's lots and lots of ways that polling can be screwed up. And you can see that just in how sort of the general political professionals, I think people on this webinar and everyone, and we're not held in the highest esteem, even though we work to, because when we're wrong, we're very visible in being wrong. And when we're right, which is far more often, no one cares because that's the assumption. So what we have to do is, in data collection and in questionnaire design, be as rigorous as we possibly can and go through just some basics. Any poll that someone does, it's understanding what the community's makeup is going to be demographically and politically. And what we want to do is randomly survey voters within that community, knowing that there are some people that are going to be more likely to respond to polls than other people. Older people respond at a higher rate than younger people. White people respond to polls at a higher rate than people of color. College graduates respond to phone polls, not necessarily online polls, at a higher rate than people who have not graduated from college. And the goal of the pollster is to randomly survey voters as much as you can. It's harder and harder and harder as response rates decline and technology changes. It's a lot easier when you can only poll people on landline phones. Those days are long, long gone. But you don't want to just quickly survey people, the first 500 people that are going to respond to your survey, because then you get a survey of just people who want to take polls. And at Change Research, we try to combat this by, when we do advertising to recruit respondents and when we send out text messages, we don't send out one ad saying take the survey. We send out a variety of different ads based on people's gender, their age, their geography, and particularly their race and ethnicity. So what we're getting back is as representative as possible. And we want, key of polling is to pick someone you want to survey, call them or email them or advertise to them 3 or 4 times. They don't sort of respond after that, move on to the next person. So what you're getting as it comes back is a balanced sample. And then when you're weighting the poll, which is to make sure that you're really, really precise on all these different variables, that you're not weighting so much because you didn't reach a group of people, because that inflates the margin of error that we're about to get to. The other big challenge in surveying, particularly in candidate surveying, is question order. you want to get as neutral of a read of the electorate as possible, whether they know who your candidate is or not. So ask them favorability. How favorable are you towards not just Joe Biden, Donald Trump, but Meredith Dixon? If you're doing a state ledge race, your state ledge candidates, Nate Gentry, just some examples of people that I've worked with or against in the past. And you just want to go by their name, not that they're state representative or county commissioner or anything that triggers voters' responses like, oh, I should know who this person is. Because if they don't know who it is just by that name, that's extremely valuable information. So what you want is as neutral read as possible. Questions that don't like inform later questions, like you wouldn't read candidate messaging before you ask a vote preference. You'd ask a vote preference, you'd read some positive and negative statements about both candidates, then ask to vote again to see which groups change their mind or move to candidates as they get to more information, which is the core of what campaign polling, what you're buying with campaign polling. But you want to sort of assess, if you want to, let's say you're going to do several messages on why my candidate is a teacher, has worked with children, this is what their background, this is what draws them to public service. You want to know before that, which party do you agree with most on education, Democrats or Republicans? To know if that's something that's a relative advantage that you want to lean into or a relative weakness that you would need to message around it. If you're, for example, your background is in CIA and military service, if people believe Republicans can best serve on that and you're a Democrat, you want to talk about your military experience in a way that's going to move people to support a Democrat and rethink how people believe Democrats relate to the military. There are several important questions to ask in a poll. Big part of it is your intention to vote. When you're looking at a voter file, you can see whether people vote in elections or not. You can draw a sample to just people who vote in primary elections. Or people that, sorry, second, mind that call coming in. You want to know people's motivation to vote, how much they follow politics, and use a variety of those questions to create a measure so you can separate out in a poll those who are definitely going to vote, who always vote and are definitely going to vote, the people who are sort of squishy, and those people about voting, those people decide elections, and then the people that we're really going to need to focus on turnout. There's always this sort of debate in Democratic politics, should we focus on persuasion or we should focus on turnout? The answer to that is always both, but the poll should have questions that are going to effectively separate the people that you know they're going to vote or the people that are just telling us they're going to vote, but by other measures of engagement don't always do that. The most important issue in a race, as Craig said, sometimes you want to ask that just as an open-ended question so you can see particularly new issues or things that you haven't thought of. Or sometimes it's just a list of sort of well-known issues and have people prioritize those. I would say I'm in a poll in the field right now of young voters in some swing states. And the top issues right now are inflation, cost of living, and housing affordability, with 80% believing that their income is falling behind the cost of living. So that gives you very clear clues on what we're going to need to communicate on going forward within this campaign. The direction of the country, state, local area, which is a key part of answering that first question that I talked about. Is there a reason to replace an incumbent or replace the party in power? And then name identification, favorability, knowing how people view candidates at the top of the ticket to benchmark on candidates at the bottom of the ticket. Working on a state ledge race, you want to know how different voters view them versus the governor, particularly the governor is positive, and know how much room you need to focus on communications with Democrats, as well as persuasion and trying to make the case in areas where Democrats don't normally win of why you should vote for a Democrat this time in this particular race. And I'm going to ask Craig a question here before he asks me one, which is how he's used like these types of questions to, when he's working on a campaign, how some examples of how these types of questions have informed your strategy or changed strategy based on the results of a poll.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about this, but before we started the webinar, and even before that, a couple of my experiences at the state legislative level, both recent ones were state Senate levels in Pennsylvania. And for me, or at least as a campaign manager in the past, getting the message out early and getting it out often, I felt if I did that and I was able to control the message, we could keep things relatively positive, which to me is, I know there are reasons and certainly benefits, I think, to going negative in terms of comparisons, compare and contrast, and things like that. Not being mean for mean's sake, but I always felt that if you did the positive, accentuated that, and really ran with that, that's how I like to run campaigns, and I used polling for that all the time. It was really important for me, especially at that level and above. And there were a couple where we had an incumbent who had been in office for quite a bit, and thought that he had a pretty good handle on what the important issues were, had a new challenger, and we were worried about a certain issue. And when we polled and tested those issues, we found out that the electorate did not think that that was an important issue at all. So it had actually dropped out of our, like every candidate in my experience has like 100 things they want to talk about. We know that we only have time or resources to talk about the top ones. And he expected that would be a top issue. And what we found out through polling, it wasn't. It didn't even rank in the top 10. So while we covered it, if asked, it did not end up being a major part of our platform. We've ended up, funny enough, in this particular race, climate change was the number one issue, which we did not expect. We expected it to be the economy, jobs. Climate change was the number one issue across the board, even among older demographics and certain minority older demographics where we didn't expect that to be the result at all. So just having that little bit of information, we were able to kind of pivot real early on what we were going to discuss in that campaign, and really one of the foundational messages of that campaign, and highlight some of the work that this particular state senator had done around those issues. And that was a huge win for us. Very similarly, we worked with another candidate who's more of a conservative Democrat, and we were worried about the changing nature of the electorate, which had been very Democratic and then had moved over the years and was kind of like a very close, very even. And we were worrying very similarly in that race that if we went too hard on some of the progressive messaging, we would lose that audience. So what we found was that was also not the case in that district. We found some of the more progressive messaging was tracking very well with the electorate. So in that area, we actually went harder on the progressive messaging than we would have otherwise done. And funny enough, much harder than the candidate was initially comfortable with. And I'll add that in that particular race, we won that race by 69 votes after recounts and after a lot of legal challenges. So had one thing been off in that race, the chance is a lot higher that candidate would have lost. So polling was instrumental in both of those races. And I would say in at least that one race, had we not done that poll and thought really hard about what the electorate was telling us through that poll, we could have very well lost that race had we not done that.
Thanks. Thank you, Craig. Part of sort of continuing the basics of a well-conducted poll is the goal that I do when I write my questionnaires is for whoever is taking the survey to not know who it is who is administering it. So there's not bias that people hang up the phone or click off the survey that they're doing. And the best way to do that is just, if you're doing positive statements about your candidate, balance it with a similar number of positive statements from the other candidate, particularly in their language. Go to their website, use the arguments they're using, sometimes clean them up and punch them up, because a lot of people who write content for websites don't do a very good job of it and need like very sort of clear and direct. If you're doing negative information about your candidate, your opponent, it should be balanced with negative information about your candidate. A lot of candidates don't like that. They do not like negative stuff read about them in a poll. Have to assure them that, look, we're interviewing 300 people. This is going to come out in the campaign anyway. And as long as it's not incendiary, like really sort of personal things that should probably be anonymized in a survey, like drunk driving arrests in the past. I've done a lot of work in New Mexico, so we've had a lot of candidates on both sides of the aisle who have been pulled over for drunk driving, or like very difficult financial situations where there could be negative backlash to just reading it. Then you'd want to ask that anonymously. How would you react to a candidate if you knew that? But for the most part, you want to understand what your candidate's weaknesses are, so you can go out and defeat them, and not be surprised during a campaign. Long ago at Hickman Brown, but cycle before I was there was a Republican running who had a cocaine arrest in his past. His name was Zach Wamp. And he did not, during that campaign, our candidate, Marilyn Lloyd, brought it up, did an ad, had his arrest record, and he was blindsided by it. It was a Republican trending district. Now it's not something that's a deep red district. But the next cycle, he got out in front of it early. He talked about mistakes he had made in his past. They seeks treatment and redemption. And he ended up winning the next race easily and was there for at least a decade before he ran for higher office and lost. I think the Republican he ran against in higher office brought up the same charges against them. But if you know something's going to be particularly weak against you, part of the campaign strategy is, okay, we need to break this ourselves. Let's do it now and be in control what the debate is, and not just assume that it's not going to be brought up by the opposition where we're on the defensive. There should never be a point in any race where your candidate's on the defensive. Should always be on offense. And that is as much a part of disseminating negative information about your candidate as it is attacking the other side. There are several things that you should not be looking for in a poll, and some preconceived notions people have, despite sort of the belief that people sort of lick their finger, stick it in the wind, and just go with whatever the public is saying. Successful politicians don't do that. Successful politicians know why they're running for office. They know what they want to accomplish. They know what their values are, and they understand the people in the electorate. What they use polling for is, how do I best frame what it is that I want to do? I have these 12 ideas that I think will make a difference, but most people can't handle more than 3. So what 3 ideas should I be talking about? And how should I talk about my personal background in a way that's going to be effective in communicating who I am and why I should be in office? And that's what polls are for. But politicians, for the most part, do not take polls to determine, okay, I should say this, I should take this side, I should be pro-Social Security instead of anti-Social Security. That doesn't happen. And quite frankly, that's not a candidate to work for or vote for if they do. Polls should not be used to disguise, to push a negative messaging or a push poll. It always drives me crazy when a poll that I've worked on or a campaign that I support is being accused of push polling because they're testing negative messaging. There's a difference between testing negative messaging and a push poll. A push poll is basically phone banking to spread negative information and gossip on someone else. The famous example, even though Karl Rove denies this, in 2000, when Bush was desperate, he lost New Hampshire by 20 points to McCain. A bunch of allies, directed, I think, by Rove, were calling Republican supporters saying that John McCain fathered an illegitimate Black child. None of that was true. He and his wife adopted children. But this is a tactic, unscrupulous tactic that people use. And that's not a purpose of polling, and it's not a good purpose of what it is that we're trying to do. And also, a poll is also not a report card. A poll is not a psychology tool to make you feel better or make a candidate feel better or worse. A poll is a tool in the campaign to help you achieve victory. So if a poll comes back and your candidate's doing better than expected, that's not a reason for the candidate to not do call time or not knock on doors and not do all the things that candidate needs to do. It's not like I'm winning, I need to do less, which is unfortunately a lot of candidates' tendencies. We've had plenty of campaign managers saying, when we have good numbers, of just like, can you temper this of you can still lose, so our candidate will keep working hard. But a poll should not be done just to make you feel better or reassure. It's what do I need to know to achieve victory? Reading a poll is also a work of art, and it's often misunderstood. And quite frankly, data journalism and Nate Silver and 538 Nate Cohn have made that all worse and harder, particularly people that consider themselves experts on polling but don't understand polling. And when you get a poll, when you see a poll, something on the news of Trump leads Biden by a point. Well, Trump doesn't lead Biden by a point. A poll is you get a number implies precision, but a poll result is a number that we believe is within a range of what the true number is. If you have a population of 1 million or 10 million or 100 million, you're only polling a few hundred people, and statistical rules, if a poll is done right, you know based on how many number of interviews you did, how well the poll was designed and how much weighting you need to do. But the 47% that Trump is getting is really a range between likely outcome of between 44 and 50. And Biden is between 43 and 49. And those overlap. No one has a lead. There's no such thing as a 1-point lead, no matter how people talk about polls on Twitter or 538. And it's within a range of possible outcomes. And if you're within the margin of error, while someone might have an advantage, you can't definitively say that one candidate's ahead or not. It's a very important way to determine polls that a lot of people don't fully understand. But the margin of error is really just dependent on the number of interviews conducted and how representative a sample is. If you get 600 completes and it's really sort of indeterminate and you have a budget, go up to 1,000. It's one of the great things about online polling is our cost for complete is so much lower than phone polling. We could do large numbers, high samples, particularly in bigger geographies, to get more precision. But true precision in a poll does not exist. And this is generally very similar to how most polls are presented to clients. All the questions are along the side, all different subgroups are along the top. You read down to see where you are with different groups. So this is an example of one of many examples of crosstabs that I've done recently. This is swing congressional districts after the last midterm, where you can sort of see, contrary to where things are now, Biden had a lead against Trump, trailed against DeSantis. But you can look at all different groups that you wanted to find and just look down. For example, that 22 GOP, not 20 Trump, are people who voted in 2022 for a Republican, but did not vote for Trump in 2020. And as you can see, as you read down, I don't know if my pointer is, within that group of voters, Trump is at 52%, Ron DeSantis is at 88%. And this is how you sort of break down the groups, find out where the groups you're strongest with, where your weaknesses are, and cut the electorate in a lot of different ways. For example, with Democrats, people reported 97% of Democrats said they supported for the Democrat in 2022. There's 95% of Republicans who voted for Republicans, and independents tilted, again, 49-45 within the margin of error, not a true lead. But you can see that independents split evenly and probably likely more voted for Republicans than Democrats, even though more supported Biden than Trump and believed that Biden won the election. And it's also important when polling outlets, other people, particularly outside the campaign, put out polls, they should all be releasing crosstabs. And then it's important to sanity check them. This was from the New York Times last week, a poll that got a lot of attention that showed the race between Biden and Trump tied. But when you look at this, sort of like what you know from looking at past polling, past exit polls, data models on Democrats versus Republicans, is that Trump was president. Trump almost got reelected president, didn't, because he won senior votes. And sort of looking at this poll that came out for the Times last week, Biden was leading 48-43 with seniors, but was tied overall, which doesn't fully make sense, and was leading Hispanics in this poll, or essentially tied 41-38 when we know he got over 60% last time and Democrats got over 60%. So you sort of look at this, it's just like, is this a problem with the poll or is this a problem with Biden? In this case, the Hispanic Party ID in this poll was over 60% Democratic. Biden's probably not at 41% with Hispanics overall, but it's something to be concerned about, but also not put too much stock in any one single poll. And sort of looking at this, the assumption is that that people are going to vote third party are predominantly younger. In this case, 18 to 29-year-olds, hardly anyone said they vote for another candidate, but 30 to 44-year-olds, 8% said they support for another candidate. So you look at this, see where inconsistencies are, not necessarily dismiss the poll wholesale, but every poll the pollster should look at this stuff rigorously and be able to sort of like, what is a statistical anomaly? What's a real concern? But crosstabs are really good ways to diagnose a poll, and then more importantly, to diagnose where your candidate is. It's sort of talking about the importance of polling over time, and this is just sort of more examples of output. It's for a ballot initiative that we polled in the last 3 weeks of the campaign for in New Mexico on universal pre-K and other things, and looked at the poll over time, saw that mid-October, we were at 58% yes. Week later, we moved it up 4 points. Week later, we moved it up another point, and we ended up receiving almost 70% of the vote. But looking at this, you can see where there's movement. In the Northeast, we went from 68 to 74. This is really important in statewide polls, particularly with candidates, to look at things by region and certain groups, because if you see unexpected decline in a region or group, that's how you adjust spending, adjust television spending, market spending, field, and you can react to different things. We worked for Oklahoma Medicaid expansion in 2020, and their last phone polling that was done about 3 weeks before the election, they were at over 60% yes. We started tracking with about 2.5 weeks ago, we were at 59% yes, and we lost a point every 2 to 3 days until the last poll was at 51%, and the yes got 50.5. But the campaign used that data to shift money around, saw where the declines were, tried to reinforce them with certain groups in the electorate in order to squeak by, which they ultimately did. Just one more also example of a time series and just how dynamic elections can be. This is from probably the most overanalyzed election of our lifetime, Hillary versus Donald Trump. And this is just Hillary's margin in all public polls. As you can see, there were lots of different polls done, was showing lots of different margins. And I had a smoother line to sort of look at what the trends were and what they were. And as you can see, Hillary was never at a point, there was never any sustained period of time where she plateaued at any one level. She was either going up or she was going down. And she had up cycles. And that year when I was working for the New Mexico House Democrats trying to take back the House, which we ultimately did, my 2 waves of polling were done in the up cycles. And that was part of how I presented where our results were, which is show this chart of these things go up and down. And we did these polls in an up cycle. But if our candidates are not differentiating themselves from the top of the ticket and have their own brands in their district, they're going to be subject to the same dynamic that's existing nationally with Hillary. And she was going right down ultimately where she won, which was by about 2 points, which didn't help in the swing states. But pollsters often say that a poll is a snapshot in time. Sometimes that actually is a cop-out with why results are different than what the poll said. But the other thing is campaigns are dynamic. American voters are unpredictable, and they're always moving around, particularly in times of turbulence, which we certainly existed in 2016 and also in 2020. And I'm going to hand it back to Molly to talk about all the other different ways people have to poll now.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I will try to move through these next 2 slides very quickly so we have some time for additional questions. But to one of the earlier questions that came up in the chat, I want to talk a little bit about what to consider when you're thinking about hiring a pollster or potentially doing a poll for your campaign. And one of the biggest ways that different polling firms are differentiated from each other is in the ways that they recruit their survey respondents. So we were talking about how a really important part of an effective poll is having a balanced representative sample of the universe of people you're trying to understand. And the ways that we can reach those respondents and reach a representative sample vary greatly based on the firm you're talking about. Sort of the legacy approach has been phone calls. As Stephen was talking about, having a call center, so people who are paid and they call different folks. At some points it could have been random phone numbers. Now it's calling people from the voter file and try to speak to them on the phone for a 10, 15, or 20-minute conversation. There's another approach that is called IVR, which is automated phone calls. So instead of paying live calling centers, you would have an automated message that asks various questions and then responds with, people respond by clicking a number to put in their response. We rely on a different approach, which is something we call dynamic online sampling, which is sending out digital online advertisements that point people into an online survey instrument, like that little button in the right-hand corner. It's an approach that we pioneered when we originally founded, and allows us to do polling in a way that's very accessible. We can reach respondents 24 hours a day. They can take it wherever they plug into the internet. They can take a break to answer a question from their kid and then return to the survey and finish the poll. So it allows us to poll in a way that's accessible, affordable, and still accurate. We also combine dynamic online sampling with another approach, which is very common in the industry, which is text to web, which is a word for texting voters a link to a survey that they then take on their handheld device. And you may have received, communications like that say, make your voice heard, and you click on the link into a survey. Another form of recruiting respondents is something called an online panel. So these are different survey providers that have an ongoing survey that they're running, and people can take the survey online and maybe get, a $5 Amazon gift card or some other small monetary compensation. Online panels are probably best suited for people that need to track specific things over time, because you can guarantee that you're talking to the same person or the people in that panel over a variety of months, versus when we are doing our own polling, we're tracking issues, but we're getting fresh representative samples every time. So the exact people that were in our survey the first time are not going to be the exact same people that were in the survey the second time. There's other approaches like postcards or direct mail that are less common, but are things people experiment with. And again, anything that sounds more labor intensive is more costly. And there are certain pros of that in terms of, I don't know, at some point there was a perception that it increases accuracy. I don't think really that is the case. And you can get really highly accurate samples online and through approaches like Change Research utilizes at lower costs. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Stephen. So again, what do we do, and what do most firms provide you if you're thinking about using polling? So there's polling is a component of quantitative research, and quantitative research is data. It's looking at folks with a quantitative lens. We can do things like a benchmark poll. So this is when you're starting your campaign and you want to test all of those messaging questions. You want to really dig into your campaign strategy. You want to run with a benchmark poll. Later on in the campaign, you might use a tracking poll to see how the campaign is going, check in on where the race stands, things like that. There's a whole other component of research, which includes qualitative research. So that's in-depth interviews, focus groups. That's helpful for kind of longer term messaging campaigns. And then there's also data and modeling. So things like building out a custom model, which is complex and we won't cover here, but it's another way to sort of identify your target audiences. And then to the point, just a little bit, final question on, cost and how to think about who you want to hire. I typically recommend that polling should be about 10% of your budget. So our polls are on average between $8,000 to $20,000 for a poll, and that's on the high end. So that thinking about what your overall campaign budget is, you can think about if it makes sense. We also need to be looking at whether we can get a representative sample in your geography. So it needs to be a certain level of number of voters or number of people in the population in order to be able to get at least 300 is our target for the minimum sample size. And then just in terms of who you want to hire as a consultant, again, cost is always a concern, and methodology, but also it's important to make sure you work with people that you like, that you think are gonna listen to you. We always say that we're in the business of writing the best survey and in figuring out the best way to understand the questions that you have. But ultimately, the campaigns we work with are the experts on their community and on their race. And our goal is always just to make sure that we're spotlighting their messages and answering their questions and helping them understand the race in the best way possible. And they have the answers in terms of what they care about and what they want to speak to on their campaign.
So we have a couple questions, which I'll read off here, and then I'll launch a quick poll right here at the end too. We'll do our own poll, one question poll. But the first question is, how can polling be designed to help track potential Democratic Party voters that are not always represented by voter data, and when the data is noisy or incomplete? So in Georgia, for instance, because the data is pulled from the Secretary of State, which has malicious purging tactics, African-American groups are often not represented equitably outside Atlanta Metro, which ultimately impact campaign resource allocation. Does that question make sense?
Yeah,
Can you answer that?
There's a lot to that question. And part of when I first started working in polling, our approach was back when just people had landline phones and people answered surveys anonymously, would be to have the broadest possible reach to get people to answer surveys. And that would allow us to get into populations where if we're relying just on the voter file, you're right, they would not be there. And with dynamic online sampling now, sometimes we target off the voter file. Oftentimes in a state like Georgia, we would not. We would ask people, we target people geographically, and then ask them questions if they're registered to vote, and questions about, are they certain they're registered to vote? All the sort of things that would identify the problems that you're talking about there. And I think we become a little too, I'm not going to say this, slightly too reliant on the voter file, even though NGP Van is sponsoring this call, this webinar. But you're right. When you're polling, you want to have the widest possible audience. And part of that is understanding where the unrepresentative populations are going to be and really make an effort to reach them so that you have the largest possible potential for people to respond to surveys. And because in situations like that, we will miss potential voters. Pollsters missed Trump voters who had never voted in an election before because they were only talking to people who had vote history. And the same thing that you're talking about, we too often leave out those voters, and understanding that if we can get those voters to vote and talk about the things that they care about, then we will win very close states like Georgia. I believe that will be the case this year in Mississippi and Louisiana as well.
A couple other questions coming in. Target geographically in quotes. I think this is a reference back to when you mentioned that targeting geographically. Where do you get that data if it's not in the van?
Usually you can do that. We have a ways where we can draw a map, sort of a map online geographically using latitude and longitudinal coordinates that match up well with even the most ridiculous gerrymandered districts. we try to target on zip code. That is not often possible. And when we do that, we sort of overlay actually physically drawing a map that we're surveying to. And then when we're doing text message solicitation, that usually is from the voter file, since people's phone numbers and area codes and exchanges they used to match up to things geographically. They don't even come close to now. So that's also a level of geographic precision we do. And we even do things, we ask people for their personal identifying information at the end of the survey. And I have gone through and taken those names and addresses to specifically match them to the voter file to make sure that we have the right geography, particularly in small, very creatively drawn districts.
And Craig, I know we're at time, but
Yeah.
I did accidentally not answer one of the questions. So someone asked a question about what sample size you recommend when using likely voters from the voter file. And I'll just say that that's something that your poster will help guide you on, but it's really dependent on the overall population or the overall size of the likely voter universe. So that's what I mean when some geographies or populations are too small to pull. That just means there's not enough people that we can get 200 to 300 responses in that population and have it be representative. But typically that guidance, it is based on the overall population, and it be 300, 400, 500. Nationally, we do 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, etc.
Cool. No, that's perfect. Thank you. And just I launched just a quick poll on our side for those who might want to learn more about polling, how to use it in your campaigns broadly, or if you want to hear directly from Change Research, just click on that, either yes or no. It helps us make sure that we're communicating with the right people, not spamming anybody. That's the last thing we want to do by sending out too much information. As I mentioned at the start of this, we will take a copy of the video and make that available to everyone who registered, along with the deck that Stephen and Molly just presented. And then if there's any other, I don't think we have any unanswered questions, but if there are any additional questions that you think of now, or even later by looking at the deck and rewatching the video, if you want more information, just hit reply to that email, and either we'll reach out or Stephen and Molly will reach out. Looks like there's one additional question following up on Daniel's question. Once you've drawn the geographic area, do the names come from geographically tailored social media ads? How else would you get the names of people to poll?
We would either get them for the voter file, or when we're drawing a map, we rely on the social media provider to target that area geographically. So they're not targeting specifically people by name. They're targeting the ads people will see to them, but they're not personalized to individuals, and we don't restrict them based on vote history or other characteristics.
Yeah, so I'd sort of describe it as kind of going out into the geography that we're trying to understand and having a general advertisement that says make your voice heard, and then people can choose to respond to that solicitation or not. And then we ask a series of questions to make sure that they're the people that we want to be speaking to.
And sometimes people see those ads multiple times before the algorithm moves on to different groups of people. But it's sort of the same dynamic of calling a number 4, 5, 6 times and then moving on to the next number.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. We're just a couple minutes over. Thank you very much, Stephen and Molly, for all the info. It's a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for the engagement and the questions. We will get the information out to everyone probably in the next 24 hours. And again, if there's any other follow-up questions, or if there's a particular angle of this that you'd like to see follow up on, we could certainly chat again and maybe do another one of these. So thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Look out for that email coming in the next 24 hours. Talk to you soon.